say it's not that cold if you dress for it, right? Not a problem. It gets cold inside, like the lungs. Okay, folks, it's the last lecture. Your final is in this room on Friday, 8 o'clock in the morning. It's mostly on this last third of the course, but there will be 15 questions from the first two-thirds, so it is a comprehensive exam. Now we are offering, ta-da, a last-minute special here. A Q&A, a review session for this class will be held upstairs Thursday at 2 o'clock. So if you'd like to attend a review session, my co-instructor in the honors course, Annika Moe, will be there to answer all your questions and lead you through some review of the whole course if you'd like to show up at 2 o'clock on Thursday. Now, I messed up on your last in-class quiz, and I had to do all your grades by hand. Poor me. It wasn't that hard, except I know for sure there are about 19 people at least who took the quiz, but I couldn't figure out from the clicker number. So, if you'd please look at your grade books, okay? And if you took the quiz number 11 and you didn't get a score, email me, okay? And what I didn't say on this, but what I'd really like you to do is you can send me the serial number for your clicker, okay? And then I can give you your score, okay? Okay, it's the last day. We've been ending the course with a survey of various fields of ecology. Today, we conclude the course with conservation biology, where we're now going to confront the human impacts on natural systems. Before we do that, though, I want to take the longest possible view of life on this planet. We already looked at the conditions that led to the origins of life. It had to do with the nature of the atmosphere, the lightning around the volcanoes, all those things that allowed a replicator to emerge. Today I want to ask, how's it going to end? Because end it will. Life will not be infinitely inhabitable. The future of the earth depends on the future of the sun. That's the source of energy which currently provides us with our food through photosynthesis and all the autotrophs. The sun is about 4.5 billion years old, and it's just right for life on earth right now. However, a billion years from now, the sun will be 10% brighter. There'll be a lot more energy coming to this planet. Our oceans will start to evaporate, and there will probably only be a few marine pools that could possibly host life. 3.5 billion years from now, the sun will be 40% brighter. All water will be lost. The Earth's atmosphere at that point will be like Venus today. Under those circumstances, no life as we know it will be possible. So there is an absolute end to life on Earth. Here's our planet. It's been inhabited for billions of years with life, and we've seen that over history, there have been a number of catastrophic events that led to great extinctions. 435 million years ago, every 80 to 100 million years, the most recently being 66 million years ago. I want to focus on the last three. At 252 million years ago was the end of the Permian. There was a dramatic reduction in the diversity of life on Earth. 90% of all marine and terrestrial species went extinct in a very short period of time. What happened? Well, that coincides with enormous geological activity. It was the formation of what are today called the Siberian Traps. These are lava flows that stretch all the way from Siberia to India. This released enormous amounts of greenhouse gases. The planet warmed up to the point where the oceans would be too hot to swim in, hotter than a bath. At 201 million years ago was the end of the Triassic, another massive die-off. 76% of all marine and terrestrial species died off. Again, geological activity. This time, it's pretty well established that Pangaea, which is when all the continents were connected, Pangaea began to split up. And as it split up, there was a 40,000 year period with enormous volcanic activity, yet again, releasing enormous amounts of greenhouse gases. It raised the global temperature by 3 degrees Celsius. Just a 3-degree change in temperature was enough to kill off 3/4 of species on Earth. 66 million years ago, the end of the Cretaceous. This is when an asteroid that was about 10 kilometers across struck what's now known as the, I've got it written down, the Chicxulub crater in the Yucatan Peninsula. There was also an enormous amount of volcanism again, probably triggered by the asteroid strike. All the dinosaurs went extinct. Now we are at a point in the planet that has never had this kind of dominance by a single species. As of today, there's 7 1/8 billion people on Earth. The world population has grown by over 21 million people since we started class back in September. That's like adding the population of Australia or Taiwan. It's growing 6.5 million people. That's like adding Los Angeles and Chicago every month. All the impacts that humans are having right now are being felt by life everywhere on Earth. This is a conservation organization that's international, IUCN. They rate each species as to whether it's at threat of extinction. So they have various classifications. It's vulnerable to extinction, endangered, critical, or it's gone extinct. They do this variety of different taxonomic groups. There's some plants on here, some amphibia. Doesn't really matter much. Lots of different organisms, with a fair chunk of them showing risk of extinction. If current trends continue, it's estimated that 75% of all animals will disappear within the next 300 to 2,000 years. That's a rate of extinction almost identical to the Permian and the Cretaceous mass extinctions. So what? So everything's going to hell. Who cares? Who needs all these different species anyway? Does it really matter? Well, research suggests it probably does matter. Some of the most important studies are actually done, amazingly enough, here in Minnesota. There is a research center up in Cedar Creek, just north of Coon Rapids, headed by this man. He's a Regents professor now, Dave Tillman, in the ecology department. And he's done a series of studies out there looking at plants that are very carefully monitored and regulated. And the idea was, in all these different plots, was to either establish a monoculture where there's just one plant species in the whole plot, or two species, 4, 8, 16, all the way up to 32. So some of these plots in this big grid here are very rich in biodiversity, some are not. Now, some years are different than others. I mean, like right now, it's freaking cold. It wasn't this cold in last December. So year to year, we get a lot of variation of the weather. Some years we get normal rainfall. Some years we get floods. Some years we get drought. The important thing for this particular study was what happened to these plots during a drought where a lot of things suffered from a lack of moisture. And what Tillman's study showed is that after the drought was over in 1989, that the amount of biomass, that is, the amount of plant material that's still growing after the drought, depended very much on biodiversity. And these monocultures, they really suffered from the drought. If there's only 2 species, they did better if there's just 1. 3, 4 are better, but you reach a much safer zone when you have a variety of different species living together. Diverse systems are much more resilient. And it's not just plants. Around the planet, people catch fish for food. We've seen things about fisheries before. And some of these places, as we've already seen, have been over-harvested. So peak fisheries have already passed through most of the oceans. But the planet varies in how biodiverse, how many different species exist in the oceans and seas. So some areas up here, they're fairly simple. There's only maybe a few dozen or less than 100 different species of fishes. But in the tropics, they're much more biodiverse, thousands of different species. Now, there's been extinctions everywhere that people have gone fishing, but in systems that are very diverse, the number of species that disappear per year has been relatively low compared to the simpler ecosystems, where there's relatively few different species. A higher number of species are falling below 10% of their peak. And the cumulative collapse now, so adding these changes each year all together, the more biodiverse systems are withstanding over-harvesting much better than those that are relatively simple. Collapse is going pretty rapidly, and this is pretty bad. This is like 80% collapsed taxa in the most recent data here from these simpler systems. Okay, so you lose the species again, so what? Well, it matters in terms of the actual amount of food that you can get out. And so the harvests that are still being extracted from these places are far higher where there's much more different species. So species richness is the number of species in the ecosystem. This is a log, so if it's a log 3, that means there's like 1,000 different species. And the productivity in these very rich systems is still about 60-70% what it used to be, whereas in these simple systems, it's really down. Whoa. Okay? So rich systems can withstand over harvest. Rich systems can withstand drought. So what I've been saying so far is that we've seen various global scale catastrophes that have obliterated much of the world's biodiversity over geological time. That biological complexity is really important for strengthening the resilience of ecosystems. We do need these other species. So what are the threats to global biodiversity? And I'm going to go through a series of factors. And the first and the most obvious one is habitat loss or alteration. As people do more and more agriculture, convert more natural land to parking lots or whatever, this creates islands of natural habitat out of what used to be large continuous populations. In North America, this is a map of the forest cover in Cadiz County in Wisconsin, just across the border. And in 1831, most of Cadiz County was forested. By 1882, settlers had come in and started establishing a lot of farms, so now you've just got a few patches of forest here. And those patches get smaller and smaller and smaller, and further apart. We see the same thing happening today in a lot of parts of the tropical rainforests. In Brazil, as the rainforest is being cleared, you get islands of remaining rainforest. Madagascar, which 2,000 years ago was all tropical moist forest on its east side over here, dry forest over here, and now a few tiny little patches left. So this kind of fragmentation is happening all over the world. Now, the reason to worry about this is that if we view each one of these remaining patches of habitat like an island, small islands sustain fewer species. These are real islands in the Caribbean, and you've got some islands that are pretty big, like Cuba, Hispaniola, and some that are pretty small, like Redonda and Saba. If you look at the number of species that live on these different sized islands, the larger ones host much greater diversity than the smaller ones. Further, species that do live on these small islands are more prone to extinction. This is looking particularly at birds. So this is the number of bird species, percent of birds that go extinct after 50 years after the woodlots had been carved into small blocks. So these are 21 hectare blocks. A hectare is 100 square meters. And these are larger blocks, they're 10 times bigger, but they still show extinctions as well. So for a given initial abundance of species, the small islands show a greater loss, a greater extinction rate. Okay? Now, these islands suffer, in many cases, from what is called an edge effect. So if you have a continuous rainforest like this over here, it sort of sets up its own climate. But once you clear cut around a patch of forest, now this is exposed much more to other things, okay? And other things can penetrate this island through the edge. So looking at edge effects, particularly in the rainforest fragments, this is how far into the edge of a forest patch we get problems. Well, let's just focus on the key ones. So that's tree mortality is elevated, so trees tend to die if they're too close to the edge. Relative humidity is affected up to about 100 meters. Soil moisture is affected up to about 80 meters. Foliage density, air temperature, all of these things penetrate in through the edge of the forest. Now, a different kind of edge effect has to do with animals, and particularly the animals that I study, the African lion. I've talked to you a lot about the basic biology of lions from our research in Serengeti. One of my former students from Minnesota did his research project in a different park in northern Tanzania, a place called Tarangire. Tarangire National Park is here, and the animals, as long as they stay inside here, are protected against hunters, and they're meant to be protected against poachers, and so it's kind of a refuge. But what we find, or what Bernard found, by putting radio collars on these lions with GPS so he could see where they went, is that, well, they were rather naughty little cats, and they didn't always behave themselves and stay indoors like they were supposed to. So they'd go outside the park, okay? Some went outside the park a long way for a long time each year. This is the park boundary. This is where they're supposed to be, okay? And when they go outside the park, they cause problems. They kill livestock. They kill sheep. They kill cattle, okay? Well, the livestock owners don't like that. So, when the lions attack livestock, the local people retaliate and they kill the lions. Pretty much an exchange rate for every dead cow, there's a dead lion. Okay? This has had a nasty effect on this lion population. Over the first 7-8 years of his study, the lion population around Tarangire, inside Tarangire, actually declined by 25% thanks to this edge effect. What can you do about something like that? How do you protect lions from their own impulses, which translates into a serious edge effect? There are places in Africa where lions live and they don't get into trouble. Here's a park in Kenya, Lake Nakuru. There's one in South Africa. Those lions don't suffer from edge effects at all. And they're protected because they live in reserves that are surrounded by a fence, a wildlife-proof fence. When we looked at the status of lion populations all around Africa, we could say whether the population was as healthy as it should be based on how many lions were there, compared to how many there ought to be. And so populations that were fenced were almost always really, really healthy. If the park was not fenced, it's possible if you spend a lot of money each year to kind of protect the lions, but it's really, really expensive. Okay? So at least in terms of current status, fencing is a really good thing, but you can spend a lot of money and get a similar result. But in the long term, if we extrapolate recent population trends forward, there's an extraordinary difference between the two circumstances. All of the fenced reserves we know about in Africa, we expect to be viable in the coming decades or even the next century. Fencing works so well that none of these populations are likely to be exterminated by angry neighbors. But in the unfenced reserves, our data suggested that about half of the current lion populations that are not fenced in Africa will essentially have gone extinct in the next 30 to 50 years. So edge effects really matter, and a fence, at least for lions, is a good way to protect them. Next horrible thing is invasive species. This is from Minnesota. Certain lakes around here look beautiful in the late 1960s, but by the late 1970s, a plant that some freaking poet brought over because it was a plant that was mentioned by freaking Shakespeare, and he decided, I want to look at the plants that Shakespeare wrote about out in my yard here. And so the plant got loose, purple loosestrife, and it's grown with such vigor that it's choked out many wetland areas. Zebra mussels. Zebra mussels were not brought here by Shakespeare-loving people, but by boats. Travel around the world, and various things that get into the bilge of the boat, when they drain it back out, they threw some zebra mussels into an American waterways. And I don't know how well you can see that, but this should be green plants with reeds and other stuff, but it's been overwhelmed with these freaking little zebra mussels. Those are all shells everywhere, again, choking out anything else. Asian carp. Asian carp. There's some hilarious YouTube videos of people being smashed in the face by these fish that freak out when a boat goes by. But it's really a pain because they're dominating a lot of the American waterways to where they're driving native species to extinction. Okay? What these all have in common is that they've been brought to a new system where there are no herbivores that eat purple loosestrife. There are no carnivores that eat these things or these things. So they don't have any natural enemies. Their populations are no longer being limited. So they've got predator release, they're escaping diseases, they're escaping all kinds of things. So they can grow like crazy, exponential growth. Okay. Next we get to overexploitation. This has been a hallmark of our species. Remember, we originated in Africa. And we left Africa as a species by 50,000 years ago, got to Australia, went through Siberia, got to the New World, etc., etc. Now, we originated in Africa, so the animals that live there are kind of used to putting up with us, okay? And if we look at the number of species that still exist in Africa, they're not too bad since modern people hit the scene. But in Australia, these species had no clue about predation, okay? When the Aborigines hit Australia, they drove many, many, many species extinct in a very short period of time. I mean, Australia is still famous for its crazy possums and kangaroos and everything, but there used to be things that were huge. There used to be birds that were enormous, and they're all gone really fast. When humans came across to North America, the key one is at about 12,000 years ago. We used to have giant sloths. There used to be all kinds of crazy animals in North America that disappeared when the Native Americans first landed here. Most recently, going to Madagascar, New Zealand, again, people arrived and swamped. Species disappeared very quickly. Now, in Europe, it's not on this graph, but in Europe, the exhaustion, the collapse of a lot of these species coincided with our getting better as hunters. So there's this much improved arrowhead and spearhead that's much better at killing things. And so our improved technology for hunting things led to a lot of extinctions. Again, Europe used to have lions and leopards and hyenas and all kinds of species that went extinct about 12,000 years ago. Gone once people were really a lot more efficient at killing them off. Now, after the Europeans came to North America, there's some pretty amazing examples of overexploitation. Perhaps the most profound in terms of the impact on North American ecosystems is what happened to the bison. It's estimated that in the year 1700, there were between 30 and 60 million bison that ranged from South Carolina, Georgia, down to Mexico, all the way up to wherever that is in some horrible cold place in Canada, but everywhere, even through Minnesota, okay? By the 1870s, the range had really reduced. By 1889, there were 931 bison left in all the world, from 30 to 60 million down to 931 in less than 200 years. Now, this was a deliberate effort. People didn't do this kind of accidentally. Native Americans relied on bison, so it was government policy to undermine the livelihoods of the Native Americans by destroying their most important animal, the bison. And of course, after 1889, people felt kind of like, oops, sorry. And so now there are conservation efforts. You can go and you see bison in Yellowstone and a few other places, and there's about 15,000 today. But that was really good. They did a great job at eradicating the most abundant land mammal in North American history. But that's nothing compared to what happened to the passenger pigeon. Passenger pigeon, it's a pretty bird. None of you have ever seen one, okay? But if you've been around here 400 years ago, it's estimated there were between 4 and 5 billion passenger pigeons. Counting up individual birds, between a quarter and nearly half of all individual birds in North America was a passenger pigeon. Super abundant species. These flocks would fly overhead, and it was like the sun was going behind a cloud. Huge, huge numbers of birds. There was a nesting over there in Wisconsin, nesting like a big nesting area that covered 850 square kilometers. And it's estimated there were 136 million passenger pigeons all nesting in that one area. Passenger pigeons during those times migrated between the Great Lakes and the eastern forests. But the forests were cleared, flocks were netted, they were shot. Pigeons were sold at market for 50 cents a dozen. And look now, this guy's just shooting into this black cloud of birds, and every shot, a dozen birds fall. Okay? You do that long enough, and things get really bad. And here's Martha. Martha's a very famous individual specimen. She's on display. And it says, last of her species, died at 1 p.m. the 1st September 1914, age 29 in the Cincinnati Zoo. That's it. There's no more passenger pigeon. Unbelievable. Pollution. So we've looked at the 5 essential elements when we did ecosystems a few days ago. We looked at the carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle. Oh, hey, there's another one I left out to talk about today. The phosphate is another key element. But phosphates in our detergents, phosphates in our fertilizers. Okay? And phosphate is a really serious pollutant. And it's worst in areas where there are more people. Here's a study from Europe. These are different watersheds. In Luxembourg, a tiny insignificant country next to Belgium and Holland. If there's anybody from Luxembourg, I apologize, but otherwise, yes, it's small and insignificant. Except that it provides a good study area for looking at how much phosphate is in the water in each one of these watersheds versus population density. And no surprises, but where there's more people, there's more phosphorus. Okay? So there's more detergent, more stuff happening where phosphate is going out into the environment from human use. Now, phosphate being a key limiting element, just like nitrogen, if you put too much into the environment, you get eutrophication again. And good old Wisconsin serves as another example here for phosphorus pollution. This is not, I showed you eutrophication before from nitrogen pollution. This is now from phosphorus pollution. It's the same problem. Okay, so it's clear. Whatever scale you look at, human activities now dominate most natural systems on this planet. And there's a variety of different ways that these human activities are inflicting considerable harm. Let's now put them together. Instead of looking at them separately, let's add them all together, and then you get cascading effects. Hey, here's a food web, right? All these different species rely on each other for their livelihoods. If something goes wrong with any one of these species, it's likely to have effects on other members of the food web. Some species are obligate mutualists. Plants can only persist if they've got a pollinator, for example. Okay? So if something happens to the pollinator, the plant goes too. So let's talk about pollinators again. Our agricultural economy in North America depends to an extraordinary degree on honeybees. They pollinate a third of our food crops. Okay? And you may go around in various places. If you ever get out of town, go to a nice place and see some beehives that are being managed. And if you look inside one of these boxes, there's a healthy colony of bees. They're all thriving, they're buzzing, humming away. And they're really critically important, especially for things like almonds. This is from California, where beehives are transported from places like North Dakota and Minnesota all the way to California so that the bees can go around and pollinate the almond trees so we can have almonds. Okay? So, healthy bee, healthy crops, all good, right? Unfortunately, in the last 6 or 7 years now, we're having real problems with what's called colony collapse disorder that kills about 30% of all beehives every year. Okay? And again, I'm going to talk about research that's being done here at the University of Minnesota. Another famous biologist on the St. Paul campus, Marla Spivak, has been looking at colony collapse disorder, and I'm now going to talk a bit about her work. The thing about colony collapse disorder is that instead of this healthy hive, inside one of these that suffered from this colony collapse, it's gross. It's like just bee diarrhea and horrible rotting, pupa and everything. It's disgusting. What could cause something that's ordinarily so functional and so hygienic to end up in such a god-awful mess? Well, the research by various people into this problem suggests it has multiple causes. The crops that we want the bees to be pollinating are also subject to predation by unwanted insects, and so farmers spray their crops with pesticides. Pesticides are used all over the place. Problem is that a pesticide that kills an insect can kill not just a boll weevil or some nasty worm, but it can also be damaging for the bees. And looking at the intensity of these different kinds of pesticides, lots of different kinds of pesticides are being brought back to the hive in the pollen by the foraging workers. They're basically bringing back poisoned food from the fields. And it's also very abundant in the beeswax. Okay? So all these different poisons being brought back and being incorporated into the bees' hives at the structure, as well as in the food. There's also a problem with the nutritional levels. A traditional garden has a lot of different species. It's diverse. It's like one of Tillman's plots with tons of different species in it. Okay? When you have a variety of different crops close together, one colony of bees has access to different kinds of pollen. And each different pollen has a different kind of protein with different amino acids. It's got different colors. It's good for them to have a diverse diet. But so much of modern agriculture is focused on either corn or soybeans, monoculture. So here you have the farmhouse here's your farmhouse surrounded by one crop. And so the bees near these areas can only bring back one kind of pollen. It's a very simple diet that may not be adequate to meet all their nutritional needs. And then there's an invasive species. Besides purple loosestrife, Asian carp, another great thing that's come into North America in the last few decades is got this lovely name like from Star Wars, Varroa destructor. Okay? First seen in the U.S. from Asia in 1987. None of the bees here had ever encountered it before. So Varroa is a mite, attaches itself onto the bees, sucks their blood, and when they go and they tend to the eggs, some of the mites hop off and get in and they start sucking on the pupa. Okay, now the mites are being happily fed on the developing pupa of the bee. As it emerges, now it goes off and spreads the mites. Okay, so you got this very, very persistent invasive species integral now to the colony. And research shows that the more of these mites that are in a colony, the less the bees grow up to weigh. They don't live as long. Their immune system is suppressed. It's not nice to be sucked on by this freaking Varroa destructor your whole life, okay? And these things spread viruses. They carry diseases. So, here's the whole network. You've got an invasive species, Varroa, that comes in and is sucking the lifeblood out of these bees. You've got them being exposed to pesticides. Their food has been simplified. And now they're also being exposed to new viruses and also another parasite called Nosema. All of these together, acting at the same time on a hive that's doing its best to raise its offspring, pollinate all those plants, and it collapses. Not good. So, there's a lot of people out there that are thinking hard about these past great extinctions. The end of the Triassic, 76% of terrestrial species went extinct. But that gave rise to the dinosaurs. There's an open planet, literally, for something relatively large, and the dinosaurs fill the niche. You have the age of the dinosaurs, which persisted till the next big disaster. The end of the next big disaster, now the niche opens up, and whereas mammals had been relatively small up until the asteroid struck, now they could fill the niche that was left open by the extinction of the dinosaurs. And after that, you have the age of these incredibly large mammals. That thing's enormous, and it's a mammal. It's huge. Okay? So you have these very big species that are able to occupy a brand new ecological niche over the tens of million years after the extinction of the dinosaurs. So here we are today. And let's put some context into here. This one right here, 76% of the species that went extinct, that's because Pangaea broke up. All those volcanic gases led to a 3 degree Celsius rise in global temperature. That's it, just 3 degrees Celsius. Okay? That was a profound long-term ecological impact of all of that volcanic activity as the continent split apart. Best estimates right now are at least a 4 degrees Celsius rise in temperature from our current consumption and emissions of fossil fuels. This is serious. Okay, so, hey, Permian came and went, dinosaurs could take over. Hey, Cretaceous came and went, big mammals could take over. So, we're mucking things up. Something will survive, right? New lineages will arise. And we can guess what'll come next, millions of years from now. Surely the cockroaches will make it through. No matter how much we heat up the planet, there'll be cockroaches, right? They can diversify in future. We could have the giant cockroaches of 10 million years from now. Or maybe rats. Rats thrive with where we are. They do okay. Okay? Or pigeons. Come on, you can't get rid of those pigeons. Those aren't passenger pigeons. These are city pigeons. They're tough, right? They'll make it through. There'll be sort of 5,000-pound pigeons stalking the earth 20 million years from now. Who knows? For sure, the bacteria will make it. No way to get rid of the bacteria. The planet will never be sterilized, not until, billions of years in the future. So there'll be life. Not to worry. But wait a minute, what about us? Oh yeah, what about us? Fact is, we're only now beginning to appreciate the magnitude of the global environmental crisis. As we put all these different pieces together, you see all those interlocking parts for colony collapse disorder for bees. Each one of those has been studied separately. You put them together, really bad. And hey, if there's anybody to note all this down and look back 50 million years in the future, they'll look back and say, oh yeah, that was the age of the humans. That was the sixth great extinction. Yeah, that's what it was. Okay, I want to do the quiz now. This is not the end of the class, but I want to do the quiz now in the middle. Are we ready? Are we ready? Okay. Okay. Yes. Okay. Heterotrophic respiration depends on net primary productivity. Okay. Not the other way around, for those who answered B. The answer is A. What's the most common element in the air? Nitrogen. And can anybody do anything with nitrogen? Any large organisms do anything with nitrogen? No. No. Okay, so A is not right, because plants can't directly absorb the nitrogen from the air. Gut symbiote. Now another common answer here. So, does anybody know what the composition is of methane? CH4. CH4. So it doesn't have nitrogen in it, does it? So the answer is B. Okay. Gut symbionts may indeed produce methane, but it ain't got nitrogen in it, so that's not the nitrogen cycle. Okay. There's at least one joke answered. Stop messing around. You need the point. Come on. Okay. One of them disappeared. That's good. Okay. Oh, no. Stop messing around. Okay. That was a joke. It was a joke. Okay. Okay, can somebody tell me the name of a couple of really common fossil fuels? Coal and oil. Awesome. Now, what is a fossil? It's something that's dead, so it was alive once, right? Okay. So you couldn't get coal and oil before life began. Okay. So, okay. And it was definitely amazing that we had snowball Earth after the formation of a lot of petroleum. That was in the last lecture. And also the Carboniferous stage had the Karoo Ice Age as all that coal brought the CO2 out. And so we had another. Okay, now I'm not done. I would appreciate your sticking around for the next half hour because there's just a few things I want to say, if you don't mind. None of this from now on is on the test. Okay? The course is finished. But I would like to leave you with a few thoughts, a few take-home messages. First is, I hope you recognize that as we've gone through all this material over the last 15 weeks, that all aspects of life can be investigated. Science can really address just about any question. We've looked at why is there sex? Sex seems to give advantages in terms of being able to co-evolve fast enough to keep up with viruses and other diseases. It generates diversity in our offspring. Why do males show off? Males are showing off their health to females in some cases so that they get chosen. Females benefit by having healthy offspring. Why do we die? Why are we so smart? Why are we so social? And I hope some of the things lead you to recognize that we can even ask, why should we even be moral? Why should we be nice to each other? These are all questions that can be asked in science. Now, some of the profound things that have disturbed people about biology are well illustrated in this back in the 1850s. Remember when Darwin said that he thought that we must be descended from the apes, this was very upsetting for people. And so the British Prime Minister at the time, Benjamin Disraeli, famously said, the question is whether man is descended from the apes or the angels. I'm on the side of the angels. Well, it's a testable question, actually. Has anybody ever found a fossil angel? On the other hand, there are lots of fossils that connect us with the apes. It's not at all questioned anymore whether we descend from the apes. We have got an unbroken chain of species connecting us back to chimpanzees, gorillas, etc. So there's no evidence for angels yet. Okay? I mean, people can keep looking. If somebody finds a fossil angel, it'll be great. Now, there's a lot of people around, especially in this country, who are very, very closed in the way they think about the broad history. Okay? In Kentucky, there's a museum to creationism where this little girl is playing with her pet dinosaurs. Yes, that's what she's doing. She has pet dinosaurs. If the Earth is very, very young, then all these animals must have all lived at the same time. And it turns out that nearly half of Americans believe man was created in present form within the past 10,000 years. Dead. forget all those fossils. No, it's all happened in the last 10,000 years. Now, this is really pretty well explained by educational levels. People who've never been to high school, or these are actually people who never graduated from high school, the majority of people who've got through without graduating from high school are creationists, young earth creationists. Far fewer who've been to college, and virtually no scientists are very comfortable with the idea of portraying a dinosaur as a pet for a little girl. Now, teaching evolution in this country has always been very fraught. The most famous example of this dates back to the 1920s, when the state of Tennessee made it unlawful for any teacher in any of the universities and other public schools of the state, which are supported in whole or in part by the state, to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible, and to teach instead that man is descended from a lower order of animals. So, this firebrand, this mad, crazy radical named John Scopes, he's a 24-year-old high school biology teacher. He went on trial for breaking this law. This led to one of the biggest trials in that decade. Prosecutor William Jennings Bryan said, "If evolution wins, Christianity goes." The defense lawyer for Scopes was Clarence Darrow, one of the most famous lawyers of his time. He said, "Scopes isn't on trial. Civilization is on trial. This is crazy." What was Scopes' crime? Why was he brought on trial? It's because in a high school in Tennessee, he used this textbook. And it's got a page in here. It says evolution. It's got adaptations in mammalia, lowest mammals, classification of the higher mammals. Okay? And go down to the primates, and there it is, monkey, apes, and man. He used a book that included the word man in the classification of the primates. In 1926, Mississippi said, "Man, Tennessee, they're great. We'll do the same thing. We'll have the same law." In 1927, Scopes' conviction, he was convicted, by the way. Clarence Darrow failed to get him off. Scopes' conviction was overturned on a technicality. In 1928, Arkansas also banned the teaching of evolution. It wasn't until 1967, 40 years later, that Tennessee finally repealed its evolution law. In 1968, the U.S. Supreme Court finally intervened and said, "Arkansas, no, that's separation of church and state and all that stuff." Okay, well, where are we now? This is a map of science standards in state schools in the year 2008. Okay? We're up here in Minnesota. In Minnesota, the school textbooks treat biological evolution in a straightforward or thorough manner. Okay? Most states do. Not Tennessee, not Mississippi, Alabama, okay, Texas, Oklahoma. So they only mention it briefly or unclearly. Okay? When it comes to human evolution, that's the key thing that upsets people. That's what upsets people. Ding, ding, ding. Benjamin Disraeli. Okay? Very few states explicitly talk about human evolution. California, Florida, Pennsylvania, etc. Okay? Minnesota, it's implied but not mentioned explicitly. And then it is even mentioned all across the Deep South. Okay? Now this is familiar, actually, in history. Copernicus devastated the world by saying, the Earth orbits the sun. He said that in 1543. I believe that the Earth is going around the sun, not the other way around. Oh, wait a minute. Psalm 93:1 says the world is firmly established. It cannot be moved. So when Galileo, 90 years later, tried to say, Copernicus was right. Actually, the Earth does go around the sun. He was convicted of heresy. And Galileo was censored the next 200 years. Okay? So given that long history of denying the obvious truth, one can only wonder when evolution will finally be taught in Tennessee. I'm not holding my breath. Okay. The next thing I want to really get across, and I mentioned it a few lectures ago, is that growth definitely has limits. Economists have a really weird idea about population growth. Here's the thing that was published just last year. It's called the Social Trends Institute, wrote that the long-term fortunes in the modern economy rise and fall with the family. Nations wishing to enjoy robust long-term economic growth must maintain sustainable fertility rates. Keep growing, people. Keep that 1% going, man. And the New York Times columnist Ross Douthat in December of last year wrote, in the eternally recurring debates about whether some rival great power will knock the U.S. off its global perch, there's always been one excellent reason to bet on the second American century. We have more babies in the competition. Come on, have kids. Come on, we got to beat the Chinese and the Indians. Let's go for it. What are you doing? Never mind. Okay. So there's this crazy idea in economics. It's always maximizing short-term economic gain. And there's plenty of people arguing, of course, wait a minute, there's got to be consideration of ecological sustainability. You can't just chop down all the forests. This has got to stop sometime. But you get this conflict. You got the people saying, don't take daddy's jobs, he needs to chop down more trees. Versus, don't do anything, okay? So it's a pretty polarized debate. You've got, as we've already seen, this crazy book, in retrospect, Population Bomb, saying that England would be gone by 2000. But then on the other side, you've got the economic types saying that the environmentalists are going to condemn us to a green hell. We're all going to just be miserable because we can't keep chopping everything down, okay? So it goes back and forth, lighting the fuse, red hot lies, da-da-da-da. This is saying that there's no such thing as global warming. It's crazy, okay? Very polarized. But obviously there are limits. I'm sorry, you can't have 5% economic growth for even 1,000 years. And you can't maintain the human population on geological terms with 1% annual growth. It's impossible. Okay? Now, these are some of the latest data on where we're at on that Malthusian question. Remember, Malthus said that biological populations will go up exponentially, but the means of sustaining that population will only go up linearly. Okay? So here we have human population, and this is rather optimistically hoping it's going to start slowing down by the end of the century. Okay? And here's food production. This is global food production. And that's a straight line, you see. And so if you divide one by the other and you get the per capita grain production, okay, how much food is being produced per person, peak food was back in 1988. There's less food per person being produced today than there was back in 1988. Okay? And with scarcity, the economists are certainly right, you're going to have problems with supply and demand, and prices tend to go up. So in the last 10 years, we've seen serious food shortages, particularly in Arab countries, South Asian countries. People are starving. It's no small deal that we can no longer produce as much food necessary to keep everybody going. And you get riots, you get social disruption, you get revolutions. Okay? Furthermore, this is without what's going to come next as the temperature keeps rising. Crop production drops as ambient temperature rises above 86 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, we're getting there. So harvests are likely to decline further. And we're now seeing more droughts, okay, with climate change. Next thing, I also hope that you'll remember from that population lecture that one of the big problems with human population growth is the impact of poverty. The poorest countries in the world have high infant mortality, they have low status for women, they have the most rapid population growth. Okay? The root issue of where we still see rapid population growth is in those poor countries. Okay? So, what can be done? And here's where actually you could potentially come in. You are at a stage where you could really benefit by traveling. Go see the world. Volunteer. Do something. Okay? There's plenty of opportunities here at the University of Minnesota. We have global programs where you can travel and you can get engaged in projects in a lot of these very poor countries. Okay? They're in CFANS, they're in CLA, and they're in IT. I do hope you'll consider that. Next is that wealth consumes irreplaceable resources. Here's a photograph earlier this year at night. And we expect to see all these lights glowing, right? There's the corridor between Washington and New York and Boston. There's Chicago, Milwaukee. There we are right there. There's the West Coast. Okay, Florida. What in the hell is going on up there? Anybody from that part of the country? North Dakota? You got it. So look, this is in northwestern North Dakota. Okay, so this isn't even in Minot. Minot's over here and Bismarck's down here. This is out in this godforsaken part up near the Canadian border and the Montana border. It's fracking. Okay? It's fracking. These are flares where people are burning off the methane that's coming out of the ground, oil production, okay? So we're consuming vast amounts of fossil fuel. We're finding new forms as we can, and a lot of people think fracking is not such a good thing. Other people think it can be helpful, but just the scale of it is really quite stunning in looking at this picture. So conservation is as in that, don't take my daddy's job away because he wants to keep chopping down trees. That's inconvenient to have to be concerned about environmental impacts. But the countries that are really well-to-do, we're the ones that are emitting most of the CO2 per capita. Okay? So the root issue here of the richer countries is overconsumption. Okay? So what to do? Well, cut consumption. Okay? You can eat smarter. You can grow your own food. You can eat plants, fish, There's a real problem with beef. Here's a dirty little secret about beef. See that? See that cow? Now this cow farts and belches all the time, okay? Now it generates an enormous amount of greenhouse gas. Okay, a cow generates more greenhouse gases than a car. Now this contraption in the back here is an attempt to capture all the cow farts, okay? So you can then bottle it, and use it as fuel. That would be okay, But beef is incredibly big source of greenhouse gas emissions on the planet, okay? Fish actually are pretty good. They are much better at converting food into biomass, okay? And this thing, the trough, it's a kind of catfish. This grows in parts of Asia where people have their outhouses above a pond and they poop into the pond and that feeds the trough. Good lunch, huh? That's recycling, okay? I've tried to emphasize in various cases how healthy it is and how long in our evolutionary history, Homo erectus, remember, walked, ran, got all over the planet. It's a good thing. Keeps you healthy. It's a good thing for your mitochondria, keeping you young. So when you have a choice, walk, run, use your body to get around, okay? But also vote, okay? This is one nice bit of hope here. This is the U.S. total CO2 emission, okay, over the last 23 years. And during the this economic boom and everything up to 2008, it was going up really fast, okay? But since then, our CO2 emissions have gone down, okay? So we're now at 1996 levels again, okay? So the last 5 years or so, America, amazing at long last, is showing signs of bringing down its CO2 emissions, okay? That's a really good thing. Now, these are estimates as to what happened to allow us to reduce our emissions, okay? So this is natural gas. There's improved efficiency on a lot of our appliances. This is now using wind power, okay? Driving less, et cetera, fuel economy. So a lot of this is government regulations, okay? The government has mandated that our appliances be more energy efficient. They have mandated that our cars get better mileage, okay? There's been a lot of effort to try to switch our power plants from coal to natural gas, natural gas produces a lot less CO2 than coal. And at least in the last 5 years, it's done a good job. It's really brought it back down. Okay, so we don't have to keep going on with this endless growth in CO2 emissions. Okay, so hey, these are frightening times, but there's some room for hope. Provided that our policies and our actions are based in some sense of reality. So I want to just close with the last little thing. Please, think about scientific literacy. I don't know, you're all non-majors. Most of you may never take another science course, okay? So this is my last chance to suggest that you try to keep up with science, okay? And if you are thinking about some important problem, make sure your sources are reliable, okay? Major newspapers are pretty good. The BBC is pretty good, okay? If you go online, you might be amazed that much of the stuff you find online isn't really accurate or trustworthy. So check for the information that's coming from universities, the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, NOAA, which does climate, Department of Agriculture. Those are good, reliable sources, okay? As a contrary example, this is a well-known media outlet found on many cable subscriptions. It calls itself the History Channel. And I happened to see this a year ago, and I was really struck by their series called Ancient Aliens. Did you know that ancient alien theorists have proposed that aliens used nuclear weapons to drive the dinosaurs extinct? Fuck me, I didn't know that. That's amazing. And that the Easter Island statues were erected by aliens? Wow, this is great stuff. Okay. Best of all, Leonardo da Vinci. Leonardo da Vinci was tutored by aliens, man, to be an engineer. That's where airplanes came from, man. Isn't that great? The History Channel. Okay, no. Okay. So, look, it's important. You're in the 99%, 1% stuff, you guys are, you're way up there. You're not the 1%, probably, but you're the 10%, And we need you. We need you to be responsible, well-educated, informed. Challenge the crazy people. Challenge the liars, okay? I want to give a little example, and this has a home base to it here. There's this crazy guy, Andrew Wakefield. He's a British physician. He published a fraudulent paper. He made up the data. In 1998, he claimed that measles, mumps, and rubella vaccines caused autism. The epidemic of autism was thanks to these vaccines, okay? And then people believed him. And the vaccination rates in Britain dropped until whooping cough and measles reemerged. And this asshole, I'm sorry, in other words, he's a liar, okay? He came here to Minneapolis. And right over there, Cedar Riverside, he met with a bunch of people in the Somali community. Said the same thing, oh, don't vaccinate your children. We had a measles outbreak in Minnesota in 2011. It's our first measles outbreak in decades. It's a liar, okay? Okay, another local figure. Recognize her? Just over there to the north, okay? She claimed that the human papillomavirus vaccine causes mental retardation. She did later admit that she's neither a doctor nor a scientist. That's an understatement. Okay? These people have to be challenged. Okay? Millions of people die stupid deaths. Okay? Flu is a preventable disease. 30,000 Americans every year die of flu. And you could go and you get a vaccine. Partly because of these stupid anti-vaccine people. Okay? Polio was almost eradicated in the year 2001 worldwide. But Islamic leaders in Nigeria and India claimed that the vaccination was sterilizing Muslim girls. So they stopped it. So there's still polio and people are still suffering. Smoking freaked me out, man. Yeah. 420,000 people a year still are dying because they smoked. Okay? So 7.5 million people have died the last 18 years because they smoked. Now, just one last thing here. Data linking smoking to cancer was published in 1950. This is not new information. Okay? So the tobacco industry did their own research. Okay? So they get celebrities come out and say, oh, man, this is great. And look, scientific evidence for Chesterfield. Okay? Chesterfield is best for you. Oh, it's a medicine now. Great. Okay? No adverse effect on the nose, throat, and sinuses. The group from Smoking Chesterfield. Right. And then now we got all more scientists and educators smoke Kent with the micronite filter. The micronite filter, which has asbestos in it. Okay? Great. Good job. All right? So they knew from 1950. Now, in 1954, there were already people complaining about the dangers of cigarette smoke, so the industry fought back. And they published this little thing in the New York Times where they said, oh, medical research in recent years indicates many possible causes of lung cancer. There's no agreement among the authorities regarding what that cause is. There's no proof that cigarette smoking is one of the cases. Bullshit. They knew perfectly well. Okay, that's why there's been all this money that's been awarded, but it was 50 years later. Meanwhile, all these people are dying of cancer. Okay? Then now, what's happening? A lot of those people are still with us. And a lot of these same crazy freaking ideas to try to manipulate public opinion is still out there. The classic case in American politics is James Mountain Inhofe, a Republican from Oklahoma, the chairman of the Senate Committee on the Environment. He's on the Committee on the Environment. He was last elected in 2008. And he calls global warming the greatest hoax in American history. He compares the Environmental Protection Agency to the Gestapo and environmentalists to Nazis. Okay? Guess where his campaign funds come from? When he gets reelected, his elections are bought out by the fossil fuel companies. Okay? So, as far as Inhofe goes, drive to work. Take your Hummer with you. Stretch it out. Use more oil. So, who are these people that do this? One of the first and most famous was a guy named Frederick Seitz. He was a well-known scientist. He was a physicist. But then he put together a fake petition claiming he had 15,000 signatures that all the scientists in the world agree that global warming is not real. He made it up. He fucking lied. Okay? What's his background? He, previous to that, received $45 million from the tobacco industry to disprove link between smoking and lung disease. So he's good at denying reality. And you have, well, that's Fox News. I don't need to go into detail on that. And you got Cato Institute, another right-wing thing. So they're all paid off to just spout out lies about global warming. Okay? 2012. This is how far above normal the temperatures were in the continental U.S. In some places we're hugely above normal. Okay, southern Minnesota, 4 to 5 degrees above normal for the whole year. That's the whole year. Okay, if you look at the temperatures, it's almost like it belongs in a different graph. It's a whole degree higher than the previous record. Huge increase in temperatures in the last few years. Earlier this year, Australia Weather Service had to change their system to add a new color because they didn't go high enough. Now they have to tell you it's going to be 129 degrees today. I'd dress cool if I could. Okay? Yeah, right. There were fires, droughts in Australia. The places are wrecked. People are hiding from the environmental impacts of these incredible weather events. The glaciers are retreating. Antarctic ice shelf is collapsing. The Himalayas, it's just, Jesus. The amount of glaciers still left is going down fast, okay? This is like average number of meters of all the glaciers left. They're shrinking fast, okay? 400 million people in Asia rely on glacial drinking water. This is no small issue. It's a big one. Heat equals energy. More energy, more moisture, more powerful storms. Katrina in 2005, the biggest storm, was almost as big as the whole freaking Caribbean. The Hurricane Sandy that wiped out the subways in New York City. Just last month was Typhoon Haiyan in Philippines. Unprecedentedly large storms, okay? So, awful as it sounds, these industries who spread these lies can be defeated. Back in the 1960s, Rachel Carson famously pointed out that the falcons and other birds, their eggs were not hatching because they were so thin. When the mama would sun it, she'd break the egg, and that was because of DDT. Within 10 years, DDT was banned. It did happen that when there was a real environmental threat, it was addressed and it was solved. The tobacco industry did eventually lose, and now, if you want to buy cigarettes in the UK, you have to see this picture every time, okay? They're still selling them, but at least people are being shown how awful, it's gross, okay? And so the Earth's going to keep getting hotter. It's going to happen, okay? So we have to ask, how long will it take? Well, there is, again, some signs of hope. If you ask people, do you recognize that global warming is really happening? The majority, every state of this great nation, say, Yeah, it's getting hotter. We get it. It's getting hotter. And even in Oklahoma, where James Mountain Inhofe is their senator, 87% of people say, yeah, it's getting hotter here. Okay. So use your knowledge. Please get involved, stay engaged, and vote because it's your planet, it's your generation. I hope you did a better job than we did. Good luck to you.
Professor, is one of your TAs still doing that review session?
Yes, on Thursday at 2.
Thursday at 2?
Upstairs in room 312.
Okay.
I can show that again. Here's the details.
Do you mind if I just take a picture of it really
Yeah,
quick?
go ahead. Sure.
Okay.
Sure, sir.
Hi, I just wanted to say thanks because
Thank you very much.
holidays.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question.